I was born in Los Alamos, New Mexico, not the usual blues destination, but my father was working on atomic physics stuff there. And both my parents were from Milwaukee, so I have Midwestern roots, but I grew up out in Seattle. And while I was out there, I discovered the blues partly through the radio. The top 40 station was pretty good about playing some blues, partly through the folk boom, and then through the British invasion, and then the white American blues bands like Paul Butterfield and like a lot of other people started tracing it back. So didn't take long to figure out a couple of things. One was that blues was a lot more adult music than the top 40 mass culture stuff. I felt like I was being fed. And the other was that Chicago was the promised land. So I applied to the University of Chicago and got accepted and came back to Chicago right after the convention riots in 1968 and got plugged in pretty quickly to the blues community through a combination of dedication and luck. So the year of 1968-69, my head basically exploded. I was lucky to be here for the last full year of Magic Sam and Earl Hooker before they died tragically by both going on the same European tour that they shouldn't have gone on in the fall of '69. Got to be tight with Otis Rush, Louis Myers, Howlin' Wolf pretty quick. In those days, there weren't many young white people like me that had any kind of knowledge or interest. I mean, there were a few, the University of Chicago crowd and people like Chicago Slim, who gets overlooked as a real pioneer of a white Chicago blues guy. But the weekend of what was supposed to be my senior prom in high school, Junior Wells played at a club in Seattle. And of course, I went to that. And Louis Myers was his guitar player, and he was very, very welcoming to me, and so was Junior. So I spent a lot of that weekend hanging around down at their hotel. And to give you an idea what things were like then, the bass player walked into Louis's room, and we were talking about Freddie King, and the bass player looked at me and pointed with his mouth open and said, he knows who Freddie King is. So access was a lot easier. And frankly, as my good friend Jim O'Neill's pointed out, a lot of the way guys looked at us in those days was they were hoping we could help them, because most of them were pretty much flat on their backs. And I met a guy in Hyde Park named David Bloom, a guitar player who now runs the Bloom School of Jazz. I was looking through his 45s. One was a copy of Frosty by Albert Collins, and it had Otis Rush and a phone number scribbled on it. So I said, "What's this?" And it turned out he had set in with Otis and then gone to Otis's for a lesson, and Otis had loaned him the 45. So, I was foolish and brash or whatever enough. It took that I would call and, you meet a few people and go to the clubs. And like I say, there just weren't that many other like me, and maybe I offered them a little bit of hope. So I got to be tight with, of course, Louis was great, and he lived not far from campus, so his place was my refuge. He and his mother lived at 53rd and Calumet. Got to be tight with Wolf early on after some initial hesitancy at contacting him. Got to be tight with Johnny Shines, who lived close to me, and every Sunday for a month, Johnny would pick me up and take me to Willie Dixon's house. Who the heck else? Willie Johnson, Magic Sam, and I got to be good friends quickly. It was an amazing time, and the ghetto club scene was still percolating, and Earl Hooker and I became close friends too, both he and Sam. It was the last year that I really would have had that opportunity, but it was an amazing time for me. That was probably the year my life expanded the most, but by the end of that year, I decided I didn't want to stay at the University of Chicago for various reasons. So I finished school in Seattle to avoid the tug of war between the clubs and my homework. And then I got a scholarship from the state of Illinois to get a library degree anywhere I wanted. So I did that in Seattle, and then it had a work agreement in Illinois. So I came back here in the fall of '74, already knowing a lot of the people here and ready to go. Otis Rush was one of my favorites just from the few records that I had by him. Something about his style and his emotion just really hit me. And the records I had were mostly So Many Roads on a chess anthology and the Vanguard Chicago The Blues Today Volume 2. But his style just really spoke to me, and he's still probably my favorite of all time. But after I got his number from that 78 that my friend 45 a Frosty that my friend David Bloom had, and about which Otis actually told me the story later. A club owner of the Castle Rock, where Otis probably was at his peak, had bought him that record thinking he could do a nice job on that song. But so I called him up, and he said, come on over. I've got a social club set. I still have the poster. It was at 68th, near 68th and Halstead. And so I went to his house. Actually, it was a very modest second floor apartment. And this to divert really quickly, it still amazes me that at this time there was a 3-block stretch of East 72nd starting at 1200 East, where Buddy and Junior lived next door on the 1200 block. 1301 was Dave Myers. 14, I guess 11 it would be, was Otis. And then across the street from him was another guitar player who had an album and a few singles out named U.S. Warren. So all these guys just lived on this little nondescript strip around East 72nd Street. But so I went to Otis's, and he let me borrow a whole bunch of his records, including some unissued acetates by him. Drove me and my friend to the social club set, and I taped the records and brought him back a few days later, and he honestly looked surprised that I showed up with his records back. I think he was perfectly prepared that they were going to walk out the door and he was never going to see him again. But after that, he started taking me, he'd come by and pick me up at my dormitory every Friday night and my tape recorder and drive me out to, it was then called the L&A, later it was the Majestic at 1422 South Pulaski, and I'd tape him all night and he'd keep half an eye on me and drop me home at the end of the night, and it went from there. It was an amazing time. I would tape Otis and others like him, including Wolf, strictly for my own enjoyment. I made a point of not aspiring to professional quality because I didn't want it to bite them. But I just told these guys, I've got all your recordings and I can't get enough of your music, and I'd like to get more. And at that point in time, keep in mind, a lot of these people really didn't have any albums. Otis had none as a leader. Magic Sam just had West Side Soul. Earl Hooker was just starting to have albums come out. But it was the only way to get them. And actually, the first time I rode home from a Wolf gig with him after I had taped him, I was reassuring him of that point. And he actually looked at me and said, "That's too bad. I was hoping you'd sell it and make yourself some money." But that was never what it was about. It was just to have more. And actually, right at that time that I started taping Otis was right when he was doing that Morning in the Morning album on Cotillion that was supposed to be his big breakthrough, produced by Mike Bloomfield and Nick Gravenites. And I heard it, and there's parts of that album I really like, but compared to what I was hearing at the Majestic every week, this didn't have the same kind of fire or directness. And, the way they played to a black audience in the clubs at that time, it was different. I've often found it amazing how open these guys were to me, to the point where one even lied to his manager that he was going to take a tape away from me because his manager was uneasy about it down at Pepper's. And as soon as the manager left, the artist came to me and said, "Don't worry about it. I'm not going to take it. I just wanted to tell him something to get him off your back." But there are a few reasons for that. One is I think they could sense that I was genuine and my interest was genuine, and I did know a lot about them and had a sincere love for what they were doing, and was very, very simpatico. And it was still somewhat of a novelty. And also, as I mentioned earlier, I think these people thought that maybe I could do something for them, because pretty much nobody was at that point, with just a few exceptions. Now, Otis was one of those exceptions, because at that time he had Albert Grossman, who was probably the most powerful manager in the biz, in his corner, thanks to Bloomfield and Gravenites. But most of those guys, it was nothing. I mean, they were singing through their guitar amplifiers. The only person I knew who had a PA system was Wolf, and his was like a dime store PA system. And now you look at these guys, and without trying to rebuke them, but you see somebody like Duke Robillard or Ronnie Baker Brooks, and they've got a rack of guitars next to them on stage. It's pretty much one per song. And then you think about guys who were singing through their amps, and the idea of having an extra guitar, that's would have been like The Promised Land. I mean, Muddy, he hardly ever retuned. He used two slide tunings, but you hardly ever heard him play in Spanish because he only had one guitar and he didn't want to stop and retune. Johnny Littlejohn, he didn't like to play slide guitar because he had his one guitar that he'd have to tune back and forth depending whether he was fretting or playing slide. And I mean, it was just very minimalist. I mean, these guys were not living well. You know, they were renting in bad areas and doing all they could to keep a car together or even to keep a guitar together. Once Magic Sam came to play a gig at the University of Chicago at the big Festival of the Arts in the spring of '69, and that afternoon people came looking for me and said, Sam needs to talk to you. And it turned out he showed up for the gig and didn't have a guitar and figured I could find him one. And I did. I found him a couple. But, that's how, I mean, it was very hand to mouth at this time. And, partly it was being a beacon of hope. But I think they had a genuine liking for me. I think they knew that I was for real. And, I was. I had to learn about the blues in a pretty haphazard way at that time. Now, keep in mind that the first post-war blues discography, and post-war was my cup of tea. I loved the older stuff, but my real heart of what I loved was the stuff that the rockers had led me to: Electrified Band, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Onward kind of stuff, Little Walter. But that discography didn't even come out till I think 1969. And if you wanted to know what a person had recorded, if you were lucky, maybe Blues Unlimited magazine had run a discography or something like that. But I basically learned about it through word of mouth, liner notes. Pete liner notes were a huge influence. I learned about different people from what he would write. He wrote the notes of the first Butterfield album and mentioned Junior Wells and Little Smoky Smothers. And when I got back to Chicago, a friend took me to Jazz Record Mart for the first of countless times, and I bought the first issue that I ever seen of Blues Unlimited magazine, and that was the Bible then. Their Living Blues magazine hadn't even started. There was no American blues magazine, so it was really just hook or crook. But I was very lucky that when I got back here, I got to know some collectors and some people in the business, and they saw that I was for real and hungry too, and some great collectors would let me tape stuff, and it was just kind of osmosis and hook and crook. And now there's so much more knowledge. I've often thought, now if you're a young musician and you want to learn, you can look on YouTube and see whether they use a pick, and you can figure out what their tuning was and what kind of acts they used. And there's just so much music that's accessible. I mean, not just performance video, but so many rarities now. Now when we're in the studio and we're trying to remember what somebody did on a song or what the words were, we just pull our phones out and the lyrics are online, and there's probably a version of the song on YouTube. Believe me, it wasn't anything like that then, but just by being around it. And I had a radio show in Seattle, 1970 to 73, and I have a bunch of those shows now because a friend of mine retired and kind of made a mission of putting a bunch of them on MP3. I think they're online now, but I listened to those shows, and a lot of it's really gratifying. I think my taste held up pretty well, and there was a continuum that played out later where I'd love these guys' records and talk about them on the air, and I'd write a magazine article about them for Blues Unlimited or Living Blues, and then later I had produced records by them when I got into that, and then unfortunately the last step usually involved a eulogy and or published obituary. But in any event, so my taste held up well. But when I look back now, the knowledge that I displayed, or lack of knowledge that I displayed listening to those radio shows, compared to most people, it's probably enough to impress them. But I realize in hindsight how very little I actually knew. Most of us blues producers, especially around here, that, like learning about blues in general, was strictly by the seat of our pants. I mean, there wasn't a book you could read about how to produce a blues record. There wasn't a school you could go to or anything like that. And I think most of us just learned it by intuition and trying to have a feel for people and at least a rudimentary knowledge of music, but also just by being around the studio and watch other people do it. And Bob Kester was great to me. He let me come to a session or two, and I had a friend named Steve Weisner who had a label called Mr. Blues, who recorded Good Rockin' Charles, a obscure, highly amusing harp player, and I talked Steve into doing Eddie C. Campbell's King of the Jungle album in '77, which was a great experience. And my buddy Wes Race, who's in Fort Worth now, was a writer and just sort of the center of the Chicago Blues grapevine, and he referred me to Delmark when they were doing the Cold Day in Hell project with Otis Rush, and said, hey, Dick knows Otis well, and he knows every song he plays on stage. He could be helpful. So that was my entree to a 40-year working relationship with Delmark. And then I got to know Bruce Iglauer, and we were both in the Blues Mafia here. And he actually started asking my opinion about stuff for some reason I'm still not quite sure about. But I eventually brought him Albert Collins, and we started working together in 1978 with Albert's Ice Pickin' album. And we ended up doing 6 together with Albert, 3 together with Roy Buchanan, 3 together with Johnny Winter, and he had me do a couple of others, a Fenton Robinson I did for a Dutch label, and a John Hartzman album. So it was just kind of by knowing the right people and being around the scene and being given an opportunity, but no systematic way to get the knowledge. I just kind of learned as I went, and I still am. The future of the blues is interesting to contemplate, and of course there are some aspects of it that are highly problematic, like the aging of most of the greats and the decline of the record business as we knew it, to the point that it really doesn't make sense to put out blues CDs anymore. People do it from force of habit and for love, but they don't do it because it's a real viable economic proposition anymore. I think we have to realize when we think about the future of blues that we have to be flexible in defining blues. I think one of the great paradoxes of it all is that there's a coterie of traditionalists who don't want to let the blues grow and change, but then when they listen to people that try to honor that and keep the tradition alive in terms of style or in terms of repertoire or both, then they complain that nobody's doing anything new. But if you try to let somebody do something new and hip, then they say, well, that's not the blues. So which is it? And I find in general that the critical contingent is far more into boundaries and restrictions and tradition than the musicians themselves are. I mean, blues musicians, like other musicians, have always had big ears. They're out there trying to make a living and trying to play stuff for people. That's what they want, whether it's folk tradition songs or what they're hearing on the jukeboxes in the clubs or what they're seeing on MTV or satellite these days or whatever it is. But I think we have to prepare ourselves for the blues to change and continue to change, perhaps be beyond our recognition, and recognize that in the case of us geezers, a lot of it's not really going to be directed at us. It's directed at our kids and our grandkids. I do think one of the problems is that there's just less external way for a person to really absorb the great classic blues. I mean, you can't go out on Saturday night and see B.B. or Albert King or people like that anymore, or hear that stuff on the jukebox. And there was a fallow period, maybe 20 years ago, 25 years, where it seemed like about the only young people around here playing blues were people who got it from their family. You know, their uncle was a musician or their father, or else they happened to have a mentor. You know, in Carl Weathersby's case, Albert King was a good friend of the family. But it's kind of changed so that there are a few younger people who actually think it's a potential way to make a decent living. Of course, most of them find out the sad truth before too long. And, you know, there is hope to me that there's more educational programs than there used to be, and I think a little more valuing of the tradition. Everybody used to lament, oh, young blacks aren't into it anymore. It reminds them too much of the old days. And white people would be horrified by that, but I'd say, well, listen to your parents' Glenn Miller records lately. Oh, heck no, that stuff is awful. So, that's not just a racial thing that people want to have something different than their parents or their grandparents had. So I don't know. I retain hope there's still going to be a scene, but I don't know how much of it we're going to recognize or really be into. I think most people grow old with the music they grow up with, and I don't like to think sometimes about what percentage of the music that I listen to is by dead people, but I also see younger people at the clubs and good turnouts at Blues Fest. So hope lingers.